Good morning and welcome. I'm Frank Kaufmann. I'm the head of the 12 Gates Foundation, and part of our work includes this interview series with scholars and religious leaders offering their insights into work relevant to the mission of the 12 Gates Foundation. This morning we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Craig Considine. Dr. Considine is a scholar, professor, global speaker, media contributor, and public intellectual based at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. He is author of many books and articles. Dr. Considine's opinions have been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, CBS News, Fox News, MSNBC, Newsweek, and Al Jazeera. He has been invited to speak at some of the leading international organizations and universities of the world. Dr. Considine is visible on social media as well. He holds his PhD from Trinity College, the University of Dublin, Masters of Science from Royal Holloway, University of London, and Bachelor of Arts from American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Considine is a U.S.-born Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. Please join me to welcome to this interview Dr. Craig Considine. We've set a little time aside to discuss some of the issues raised in, is this your most recent book? It's The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View.
Yep, that's the latest one.
Right.
Yeah, it was actually a version of it was actually, I don't think I told you this, but it was actually published in Indonesia originally, and then I did some significant work to the book, and then got it published by Blue Dome Press, which is based in New Jersey.
Outstanding. Yeah, our listeners will have the link and the way to get it. I've greatly enjoyed reading it and encourage our listeners to pick it up. It's a quick read. I had a famous writer I enjoyed when I was a student named, I forget his first initials, but it was Bainton. He was a historian who wrote, it seemed so simply, but it represented a tremendous depth of knowledge. And it's often the case that the people with the greatest depth of knowledge are the ones that are able to communicate most simply. So this book of yours is one that is easy to read and easy to understand, but it shouldn't be mistaken as superficial in any way. It reflects a lot of research.
That's great. I mean, that's like one of the, as an author and a scholar, I mean, that's like one of the best
endorsement.
Yeah, because I don't want to simply be the type of scholar that has this knowledge but is unable to communicate it in a way that anyone can really understand. And I don't necessarily deliberately do that, but I think that's just the way that's the way it comes out. And I'm blessed for that, because I've heard that before. People have said that.
Yeah, it's a great talent, and it's especially important as, at least so it's said, and it seems to be, that attention spans are contracting. So it's great. It's a great talent, especially when, as I say, right, people's attention spans are contracting. William F. Buckley said that he'll never write an article in which every reader doesn't have to look up at least one word. But I think this is a different age. He had a different mission than
definitely
getting important news out. I didn't realize that the book was initially published in Indonesia. I've spent a lot of time there. It's one of the, yes, and I can't even believe the former president there was one of the great champions of broad-minded Islam, a very courageous man, and he was my host most often there.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah,
the publishing house, it's called Nura Books, and they are part of Mizan Publishing, which is kind of like a Penguin, the equivalent of our Penguin book
very
publishing.
good.
And what they did, like they reached out to me in maybe 2016, and at the time I was blogging for the Huffington Post, and Nura came to me and said, "We want to take all of your Huffington Post articles and all your blog posts and basically just put it into a book format."
Ah, I see.
And we did that. And, I changed it up a little bit. And then people were like, "Is this book in English?" And I was like, it's not. It's only in Indonesian. And then I made the decision to, continue to kind of revamp it. And then voila, it becomes the humanity of Muhammad, a Christian view.
Very good, very good. Okay, that's good background. I was embarrassed when I couldn't remember the name of somebody I'm claiming was a friend, but it's because he had a beloved nickname that everybody knew him as, and this was my confusion. But it was President Abdul Rahman Wahid. He was the president of one of the, I think the most populous Muslim nation in the world, or possibly second to India, maybe, I'm not sure which, and a very important balance to, I would say, Middle East or Saudi societies. And
Definitely.
yeah.
I
So
think I mentioned the Indonesian constitution in the book. And I kind of juxtapose it exactly with what you just said, Frank. The Saudi constitution, which is basically exclusive, and the Indonesian constitution actually reads in a similar manner to our own constitution in the United States, with separation of church and state, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. All of these things I think are really fundamental in 2020 to any nation that wants to be prosperous. I think there are certain things that just need to be there, and freedom of religion is definitely one of the requisites, I think.
Yep. And also the other big thing in Indonesia, I believe anyway, is the commitment to women's rights and women's education. Just to the far reaches, just as far as you can drive, and then when you got to get out of your car and walk, then still that village or those women will be educated. And it was a big commitment in Indonesia, which I believe really makes a society, as you say, to be prosperous.
Exactly.
So that's great. And then just before we dive into the content, in your introduction, I read that you've been invited to speak on, the long list from the New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And then in this long list, you include Fox News, and just on the other side of the comma is MSNBC. And so I thought maybe your next book can be on reconciling that. I don't know which would be harder.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I include both Fox and MSNBC is to try to give people the impression, again, that it's not really an impression. I mean, I do try to reach everyone. Like, I'm not one of the individuals that I think we're seeing a lot of these days. It's like they just immediately denounce or separate themselves from an entity like Fox or MSNBC because of the political baggage that they have. And
Right.
I'm really trying to get into those type of spaces because I think it's important to
It's fantastic.
engage. Yeah,
It's absolutely fantastic. If you can get this, that you're invited there is really is very hopeful, quite honestly, and it's also a testament to the balance of your posture and position. I'm just going to give very quickly. The book is broke down very, very simply and very cleanly, and that's one of the reasons why it's so easy to follow. There's 6 chapters and a conclusion, and you speak on religious pluralism. That's a classical issue on the varieties of ways that one can advocate how religious religions should relate to each other. Pluralism is one of them. And you could go all the way from supersessionism. There's every imaginable way that you can define that relationship. And the secular one is disregarding religious commitments altogether. Then you talk about the civic nation and state building. That has to do with how religion's related to the state. You speak on racism. You speak on education in the 4th chapter, Seeking Knowledge, women's rights, and I would say the 6th chapter is called The Golden Rule. And I would say just human, personal and social position vis-a-vis our interactions with others. I don't know if that's a fair summary.
I think so.
Okay, so for those of us who will be getting the book and reading it, we know that we have these basic categories to understand. I'd say more primarily, I'd say a little bit weighted to learning more the Muslim positions on these things, because people here in the West may not be as clear on those, but there's a balance throughout. So to start, in the introduction to the book, it seems like part of what puts you on this path, because you're a good Catholic boy, Irish and Italian, is like,
Yeah.
it's like
the stereotype from Boston.
Yeah, it's like if I walk down the block and knock on any door, that's likely who will open the door here where I am in Queens. And so it's not a typical thing necessarily, that, not that you won't, but that the people whose doors I'm going to knock on is not going to tell me a lot about Islam. And there's some stuff that happened to you that was seminal in kind of turning you toward this particular dedication and devotion and curiosity. And you describe your experience at the time of the 9/11 tragedy, the bombing of these 4 or 5 sites in the United States, and then an immediate encounter in your class right that day, and then somehow tied to a later experience under an educator and a professor in American University. Do you want to set that up for us a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So 9/11 had a really huge impact on my life, even though I didn't feel that at the time. Like my kind of revelation on the impact that 9/11 had on me, I didn't feel or recognize that until much later, 4 or 5 years later. But the town I grew up in Boston, is, pretty homogenous, even still to this day. I mean, there's like 98% Christian. We actually have a pretty sizable Jewish community as well. And, predominantly white, so 98% white, and really had no context whatsoever for an event like 9/11, and especially the media coverage that was coming out of it. So, we saw a pretty carefully crafted narrative around terrorism and linking terrorism to, a faith tradition and then a people. And as a young, as a teenager, it was really difficult to kind of make sense of jihad and Sharia and Al Qaeda, some of these big buzzwords, because no one had taught us about these things in my public high school. Like we didn't learn about Islamic history. We didn't learn about Muhammad. And in Catholic school, I went to St. Sebastian's Catholic Church in Needham, and we really had absolutely no interfaith anything. Like I cannot remember it ever being taught to us. So, I think I kind of fell down the trap. I like to kind of refer to it as a trap. And I think a lot of Americans also fell into the trap of kind of thinking that Islam is a monolith and it's associated with these terrible things that we see in the media. So I became interested really in trying to figure out why something like 9/11 happened. Like why do these people, meaning Muslims, like why did they do this? Why do they hate us? Because, President Bush was even saying They attacked us because they hated our freedoms. They hated our way of life. And I was like, man, that's pretty intense. So I go to college trying to be a citizen, a patriotic citizen in the intelligence arena. So I was in DC. I was like, okay, CIA, FBI, NSA. I wanted to get involved in that, maybe State Department. And, thankfully, thank God, I had a brilliant professor, Akbar Ahmed, a great man, a brilliant anthropologist and scholar, very well respected, especially in the interfaith realm. And that's what really kind of that's what sold me on his mission. It was this idea of really bringing people together that some people believe are sworn enemies, these groups of people, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and so on. And, by the grace of God, really, it just connected with me. And I had a lot of faith in him, and I really believed in what he was saying, and I trusted him. And I guess the rest is kind of history. I often tell people, if I had walked into a classroom in 2004 at American University, and let's say the professor had certain inclinations when he talks about the Islamic tradition or Muhammad, I could have easily remained in the trap. It could have been quite easy to continue on this this mental framework that pitches the clash of civilizations.
Yes.
I had Professor Ahmed, and
Wow.
he really provided the foundation to allow me to go off on my own, really. So he's a great man.
Wow. Well, I know him and I've worked with him. I agree with you. But what you are saying should be a tremendous inspiration for teachers and educators. That you never know where you're going to make a difference, and you never know which of your students is going to become an extension of the simple hopes that you have as a teacher.
Yeah.
So just hearing that alone, because at the professional level, when you're doing interreligious work or something like that, you'll have these colleagues. I have him as a colleague and have worked with him, and you naturally recognize each other for each other's strengths. But just to hear it phrased like that, and the tremendous influence he had on you is really significant, especially for teachers and educators. I'm happy to hear this more. Now, this is not closely related to your book, but just quickly, I think you must be aware that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was a tremendous amount of solidarity with the United States from almost the entire Muslim world. Is that known to you? Did you ever think? Yes, correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think
we were praying in the National Cathedral. There was an explosion of solidarity across religious lines.
Definitely, and
right?
like even pretty much every head of state in the world, Muslim, non-Muslim, whatever, condemned it, and they were all right there with us, hand in hand, and then kind of fell apart, I think.
Right. So somehow right there, an enormous opportunity was lost. This was an enormous opportunity that even though these are massive tragedies and thousands of lives lost, if there could have been that energy remained following the tragedy, it would have been at a small cost to harmonize the centuries-long clash between Christian and Muslim cultures, right? I mean, we were on the verge of something.
I know. It's almost it's a lost opportunity in a way. And if you think about like how different the world would have been, because the response that, 9/11, obviously, as you mentioned, a horrific, tragic event that I think still is painful for people.
Yes.
And the response was really questionable, if I could put it that way. And it was really damaging, not only to a lot of innocent, people, but I don't think our response was good for our nation either.
Correct.
You
I
know?
agree with you.
Yeah.
So something happened, and it's almost, to me anyway, it's almost as though it's actually the decisions vis-a-vis Iraq that is more where, like, your work is to really diminish the unnecessary and self-destructive habit of hate across religious lines. But to me, it seems more the child of decisions on Iraq than reaction to 9/11. We were all together for a moment. It had it had somehow it was left in the hands of extremists. It was recognized as such. Nobody painted all of Islam with that at first.
Yeah. And I think it was like 10 days after 9/11, President Bush went to the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C., right on Massachusetts Ave. It was
Right.
actually the first mosque I've ever been to, and I went with Professor Ahmed. And if you actually read the text of excuse me, of George Bush's speech, it's actually quite good. But
Right.
his actions following, in the years to come,
Right.
blatantly contradicted his
Exactly.
his message. And I think with Afghanistan, I do think, and again, a lot of this can be kind of fact checked and verified. Um, I think most of the world was okay with going into Afghanistan. Iraq was a completely different story, though. That I think,
That's correct.
yeah,
I
that
agree
was
with you
just
100%. Yeah.
there
Well,
was,
this.
yeah, there was
Go ahead.
I think a lot of people just interpreted the US's move as just a grab,
Yeah.
a power grab, and it's sad.
Yeah. Yeah. A thousand tragedies were born in that.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, so back to your work, and so this kind of little kind of walk through just a touch of your experience, especially with your professor, and the trajectory, how a sudden almost about face on your direction of your life, and from that point onward, you become a highly effective and very committed apologist. You defend the concept of being a Muslim apologist, which I like. I like the proper use of words, and an apologist is a great word when properly understood. But in a way, you're an apologist for the right relations among religions, rather than an apologist for one religion or the other.
Right.
Is that a way? Is that kind of true?
Yeah, I like the way that you've kind of
Mm.
framed it. And you know, sometimes people will send me a message and say, why do you defend Islam so much? Or like, why do you speak so highly of it? And for me, engaging in this work is really simply a vehicle for defending, preserving, promoting humanity. Like for me,
Right.
Islam and Christianity are religions in some ways quite specific, but really humanity is something greater, and it's something bigger. And I suppose I'm an apologist for that too. And
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
ultimately that we need to see each other more as humans, and I think oftentimes less as a Muslim or a Christian, because I think we tend to box people into categories, like, so you're
Yeah.
Muslim, or you're brown, or you're Latino, or you're African American. And
Mm-hmm.
I often say in interfaith circles, I'm like, what if we really changed the entire discourse and we started seeing people as fathers, and mothers, or
Mm.
children and neighbors. And I really think that would really like shake up things in a good way. And we become less tribal. So for me, it's really about, it's about humanity, and another term, Frank, that people are starting to use when they talk about my work, because I get these messages on social media. They refer to me as a perennialist, and I
Mm.
actually was unfamiliar with this term up
Mm.
until like a month ago, and it's a proper kind of philosophy, if you want to call it that.
That is,
And I
yes.
actually am. I read it, and I'm like, well, yeah, I think I am a perennialist. If you want to
Yeah.
kind of lump me into a category. And then I was really happy to read too that Ralph Waldo Emerson was a perennialist, and I talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson in the book alongside Rumi. And
Yes.
Emerson was someone who, when I was going through this kind of transformation, when I got to college, 1920, in the summers when I was back home in Massachusetts, I would just read so much Emerson, and I loved
Mm.
it. I absolutely
All
loved the
right.
transcendental movement. So,
Yeah.
yeah, humanity. That's what it's all about, Frank.
Very good. Very good. I just had an inspiration that as you were speaking, uh, when you said, "I wish we'd just describe ourselves as human," and then I thought, what if we use these terms as adjectives rather than as identities? So you say, I said, well, what if you said, like, I'm a Muslim father or I'm a Muslim brother? At first, I thought I'm a Muslim human being, so that it would always be a descriptive, and so you'd have to focus on the core identity. So
I like that.
whenever you meet someone, you say, "Oh, I'm a Christian human being," and that if you're using the qualifier to categorize, then you've erred. Like if you said, "I'm a 6 foot human being," but then you took it immediately further, that if every time we ever were asked our identity, we'd say, "Well, I'm a Muslim son or a Muslim husband," or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's something that might be helpful in the framework for the beginning of how we relate with one another and think about one another.
Yes, definitely.
So what I had in my notes is that as we move toward this advocacy of advocating a wholesome, healthy, and in your own advocacy, loving. You even make a distinction over against tolerance, which I'll raise in a second. Actually, loving the views and positions of the other, and we already touched on this a little prior. I don't want the listeners to think I'm talking to just some naive person who's been hoodwinked. Uh, and so your book account very clearly for the kind of grotesque barbarism and kind of haunting violence
Hmm.
that is presented as faithful interpretation of Islam that we see in the world today. You mentioned specific cases. Uh, do I? Is that a fair read? Have I got? It's in your book. You're
Yeah.
not naive to.
No, definitely not. And you can't dismiss these things, and that they're in the news. They have an impact on how people see the world, and you have to address them. And we can't dismiss it. I mean, some of these atrocities, especially in light of ISIS,
Yes.
was they had a run there of 3 or 4 years,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just really shocking. And what was amazing for me was Professor John Andrew Morrow's book, The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of His Time. It was published in 2013.
Mm.
And I talk about the book, Morrow's book, in my own book. And
Yes.
what these covenants are saying is that essentially all Christians within a territory that is essentially run by Muslims are not only granted freedom of religion, but they are protected. And it says things that even if a church were to fall into disrepair, the Muslims are obligated to repair that church, right? So
Yeah.
these covenants are coming out because of John's book, and then you turn on the news and you see ISIS like destroying churches.
Yes.
And then I
Yeah.
started thinking, well, okay, we need to do something about this. We need to lift Muhammad's message to make sure that people aren't associating the destruction of churches with his teachings and the faith tradition of over, a quarter of the human population.
Right. Right. So you really have your work cut out for you due to the prevalence of grotesque misinterpretations of the tradition. And the curiosity, of course, is that those people, like I forget the name of the caliph of ISIS, Baghdadi,
Al
al-Baghdadi.
Baghdadi, yeah.
Yeah. Every other syllable out of his mouth is the Quran. Correct them.
Yeah.
They present themselves as scholars, as learned, as they speak gently and quietly. They don't. They're not maniacs frothing at the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really have your work cut out for you when someone has taken the tradition which you so elegantly present for its beauty, for its response to racism, for its response to inequality, for its response to religious discrimination. You bring out the core teachings in the tradition, and then you have people who are very, I wouldn't call them learned, I don't know what to call them, but they've created quite a tapestry out of the very tradition that you're saying is peaceful. That's a very big challenge for.
It's a huge challenge,
Mm-hmm.
and there are obviously moments where you're just like, is it working? I actually recently had an experience based on the position I took on Hagia Sophia. So I was for the Hagia Sophia remaining a museum.
Yes, me too.
Because I was concerned that all of the historic, animosities would be reignited if it turned into a church or if it turned into a mosque.
That's correct.
And so what happened with me was not, Islamophobes, if you want to call it that, or Christian bigots attacking me or anything like that. I was actually getting backlash from Muslims. And this is something that I've actually noticed a little bit more in recent years due to my work. Is like this first started off by getting attacks from people who didn't like Muslims. But then I was also recently being attacked by Muslims for the position that I took. And like people were not only attacking my position, but they were attacking me as a Christian.
Right.
And
Your right to have any view or something.
exactly.
Like
I mean, the whole cancel culture
mm-hmm.
topic, which is kind of in the news. And like, I was basically, in some people's minds, I was worthy of being canceled because of my position. So for me, when I saw the anti-Christian, anti-American, and even anti-white comments via social media, I started questioning whether I'm actually effective in what I'm doing. So like the tension and the conflict comes from multiple angles.
Yes.
And it comes from, various groups. And I think it was difficult to kind of digest the response to Hagia Sophia. It made me feel like, because I do speak a lot on social media about Muhammad, and I think a lot of people would say I'm praising his teachings, and then so people like when I post these things, but then when I take a position that they don't like, now they attack me and they make it personal. So how do I reach these people too? How do I reach the people that are able to not only respect the content that I'm putting out, but me as a person, as a Christian? So it's difficult. It's not
Yes.
easy.
Well, express sympathy because it's painful. It's painful it's a little bit of a cautionary tale. Oh, we're so excited that you've learned about the prophet, and then somehow the honeymoon's over,
Hmm.
and suddenly it's how dare you, and
Exactly. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and then the middle ground will draw ire from both sides. That's normal. And then the other thing, of course, is that I think everybody of goodness and of kindness has to come to terms with the the nastiness of what social media has. Uh, what is it? The word like kind of released on the world or something like that. It has its own. It has its own, what do you call it, nature,
Yeah.
that social media itself will be the occasion of just all kinds of bad ways of behaving.
Hmm.
It's the nature of the media, where you think you're conversing with someone and it's not even really a person right there. It's almost an avatar,
Yep.
and it's not even conversation. So anyway, I wish you a lot of, and you don't need it. You're kind of loved by God and the Spirit, so you'll get through it. But I do wish you a lot of fortitude
Thank you.
in this highly partisan universe, and you've taken on some very big
Thank you.
challenges.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things, so in your efforts to advocate for uh, a way in which believing Christians and believing Muslims find a way not just to tolerate each other, but to actually love one another and even love one another's teachings, you settle upon the option of pluralism and have an entire chapter dedicated to that. Pluralism is a very, and more recently you've discovered the philosophical concept of perennialism,
Yeah.
which is a closely related concept. The writer who really uh, made perennialism part of the fabric of thought is Houston Smith.
Okay.
So
When was he
come
writing?
across,
Was he?
he passed away about a decade ago,
Uh,
and he wrote some of the seminal writing during the time when no one believed more than one religion could. There was It was in a period in which only one religion was true, whichever one yours was. And Houston Smith began to introduce. He's kind of the father of beyond comparative religions, but religious studies. And he wrote out of a perennialist um,
have to.
personal piety. So that'll be interesting for you, especially since people are starting to brand. He's one of the greatest guys in our lifetime.
Awesome.
So
That
yeah,
name,
you're in good company.
yeah, that name rings a bell for sure. And like, I
Mm.
don't, I think Emerson, as I mentioned, is considered a perennialist, but I don't think he directly used that term. So I'm guessing Professor Smith probably kind of helped bring it all into like a coherent field or area.
Yeah, especially as it applies to distinctly existing historical religions per se,
Mm.
which was not Emerson's focus, if I'm correct. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's correct.
That's the difference there. So,
Interesting.
so on the issue of pluralism, it's a very exact way of relating, and I'm wondering if you feel like saying a word about that in the whole field of possible ways religions can be related to one another.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely. Um,
yeah, would you like to?
yeah, of course.
Mm.
So my views on pluralism are really founded upon the work of Harvard scholar Diana Eck. and
Yes.
the Pluralism Project at Harvard. And
Yeah.
in short, Professor Eck is saying that religious tolerance and tolerating the other is not good enough or necessarily healthy for a society that is as diverse as the United States. And she's kind of postulating that tolerance kind of allows stereotypes to reproduce because it's a very surface way of being like a friend. You know, it's like, well, you can do what you want and you can do that and that's okay. But like, we're not gonna really get to know you. We don't really want to understand you. And Eck is
Mm.
saying that what we need is the energetic engagement with religious diversity. And that's essentially what pluralism is. So I frame it as a way of living, it's a way of behaving. Pluralism is not necessarily, the way I frame it, it's not necessarily linked to theology, this idea that all religions have a a stake in the truth. I believe in that anyways, but pluralism for me is literally, you know, it's an active process of actually
Got it.
yeah,
Excellent.
going into communities, going into neighborhoods, going into businesses and schools where there is religion or religious diversity, and then you kind of get unfamiliar, you get uncomfortable, but you learn, and it's a way of educating oneself. And like I like to
Hmm.
use I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but I often use it in my talks. To give people a way of activating pluralism, I refer to it as deuce. So deuce as like the peace sign, and it stands for, it's an acronym. It stands for dialogue, education, understanding, commitment, and engagement. So we
Mm.
activate pluralism in this way. It starts with dialogue, right? So it starts with not necessarily diving into religious texts immediately, but again, going to the human level, talking about what it's like to live in a neighborhood. What is it like to live in a certain country or to be part of a certain profession? So you kind of break the ice. And then once you've developed trust and rapport, then you move to the E, which is education. This is where you really can start kind of getting into the deeper, potentially more contentious issues between faith traditions. And then once you go through the educational process, then you understand. And that's when, you really start seeing eye to eye. You may not agree with necessarily everything that another religious community is saying, but you understand the position and you understand their argument. And then once you have the understanding, you commit to certain principles, you commit to maybe joint projects with another religious community in your city, and then you go out there with the E and you engage with one another. So that's a way of activating pluralism, and I think it's much better than the alternative, which is tolerance. Tolerance is very standoffish, and I mean, even think about it, Frank. Like when you tolerate a behavior of one of your loved ones, right? Like there's something like it's good.
Hmm.
Tolerance is important. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not enough. We have to do
Correct.
more.
Correct. That's fantastic. Is this deuce something that you've come across, or did you generate it?
I actually generated it. I
Oh,
wrote
that
about
is
it
so
in
fantastic.
I wrote about it in my first book in 2017. It was basically my PhD dissertation, and it was published by Routledge, Islam, Race, and Pluralism in the Pakistani Diaspora. And at the end of the book, in the conclusion, I was reflecting on my methodology, and yeah, I somehow settled on Deuce, and it's really easy,
It's,
and like
yeah, it's
I
fantastic.
use it.
I love it.
Yeah, I use it a lot with younger audiences too, because a lot of times,
Yeah.
high school students are like, "How can we get involved? How can you make a difference?" And like you. you really, as an educator, we have to give people realistic, options. And you can't just say, hey, study more or do this. But like Deuce provides you with an actual framework. It's almost like a step by step process of getting involved.
Yeah, yeah, it's fantastic. I'm glad that I stumbled across this because I don't know if I would have come across your earlier
I
work.
probably should have wrote about Deuce specifically in the book.
Yeah.
Maybe the next.
Well, next one or coming up. Yeah. Um, I'm torn right now. We've hit a good length of time here. We've touched very little of a lot of the content I'd prepared for our conversation, especially its applicability not only to Christian and Muslim relations, but we're living in an unfortunate time of of race relations right now, which are being re-examined and settled sometimes in difficult and even violent ways, and they really need a lot of the insights that you introduce on a different horizon, namely the interreligious one. Um, so, but I think that we've inadvertently hit on such a valuable point, even just at the very scratching the surface, just the very first part of your book, the chapter on pluralism, that I'm thinking to conclude there rather than trail off on not being able to examine a lot of very important things coming up. Um, so I think I'd like to invite you to just say maybe one more thing in conclusion, um, and I'll lead in with this. Um, Part of your advocacy of pluralism, which I love that you have moved it away from the endless theological debate on theological truths, because that's a real challenge,
Mm-hmm.
of course, as you know. But activate pluralism or have pluralism as the way we live is what you said, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
it's fantastic. And then, but in the chapter, you challenge Sam Huntington's 2011 Class of Civilizations work, which I think has been very harmful. A lot of people live by it and adopted it. And you introduce, and I don't think that was your own, but it's it's perfect anyway. Dialogue of Civilizations as the counterpoint
Mm-hmm.
to Huntington. Am I correct?
Yeah, and what's interesting that you brought this up. What's interesting about that is not to digress too much from this book, but my next book, which I'm pretty much almost done with now. I got 3 more weeks to work on it before I have to submit it, but it's called The Dialogue of Civilizations, Muhammad's Interactions with Christians. And essentially, my theoretical framework plays with three concepts: Huntington's The Clash,
Mm-hmm.
which essentially depicts civilizations as monoliths and civilizations as being kind of inherently against certain civilizations. So Huntington said Western civilization and Islamic civilization are at odds with one another. And like it's
Yes,
very
correct.
harmful, as you said. And then right before 9/11, former Iranian President Khatami went to the UN in New York and gave a speech which was basically responding directly to Huntington. And he said, we need the dialogue of civilizations,
Right. Mm-hmm.
which really is the opposite of what the Clash is. But in this book that I'm writing, I've developed and I'm developing a third concept, which is linked to the activation and it's linked to the pluralism that you talked about. And my third concept is the synthesis of civilizations.
Oh, beautiful.
So I think my issue with the dialogue of civilizations, and I might be nitpicking here, but it's kind of like tolerance.
Yep.
When you enter into a dialogue, obviously very important, but it doesn't necessarily always lead to something that is mutually beneficial or
Mm-hmm.
enriching. And what I'm saying with the synthesis of civilizations, there were moments in time when Muhammad was interacting with Christians in a way, it was actually like it was a hybrid form of being, where he was taking things, kind of putting it together, synthesizing and creating something new. That doesn't necessarily happen through the dialogue of civilizations. The dialogue of civilizations may be more about, mutual respect and understanding, but like
Yep.
the synthesis is like when it's like human beings hitting a different wavelength, and like we've actually gone even further than mere dialogue, and we're actually finding ways of creating new ways of being. And in the book that, Frank, that you read and that we've been talking about, the biggest chapter is actually on seeking knowledge, and I dedicate a lot of time to Sicily and
Yes.
the history of Islamic Spain. And for me,
Yes.
that is the synthesis of civilizations, where you
Beautiful.
have, with Sicily particularly, you had Arab, Norman, Greek, Christian, Islamic, Lombard, all of these
Right.
different civilizations coming together, creating something new.
Yep.
So
Yep. And you do a great job of that in the book, and I was educated by that. Indeed.
yeah, the synthesis, it, I hope you could see where I'm going with it. Like
Yeah.
it pushes people to find ways of like taking the best of everyone's traditions and really kind of putting it into a pot, stirring it, and seeing what we come up with. Really,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
hybridity. Yeah.
Yeah. That's fantastic. And in this book, you have the contributions from both Christianity and Islam and the Prophet, peace be upon him. In when you are highlighting ideals, like here you're introducing synthesis, and you mention the work of the Prophet, um, in his thought and teaching. Will there, in this new book, is there also similarly Christian roots, or will it mostly be an examination of the Prophet's work and writing and teaching?
So the new book, it is biographical in nature, but it's also really like a dive into the first 600, 700 years of Christian history.
Oh, okay.
And like the first chapter, I have to go into Christological debates, and I have to go to the Council of Nicaea in 325, where Jesus basically becomes divine and the Trinity is created. And then a lot of the Christians that Muhammad was interacting with, according to the research I've carried out, were essentially heretics of the Byzantine Empire. And
Oh,
you
hmm.
had Christian bishops who were arguing certain Christological positions. The Byzantine Church, based in
Hmm.
Constantinople, they have a council, they create a ruling, and they basically say some Christians are heretics. And they basically, you had communities pushed out all the way onto the Arabian Peninsula. And
Hmm.
I tried to document in this book, who are these Christians? What did they believe in? And why did Muhammad interact with them as he did?
I see.
Yeah,
Oh, that is so cool.
yeah,
That is so cool. I
Frank,
really look forward to this.
yeah, this book was probably the most interesting for me to research. I learned, I think, more about Christianity than I did about Muhammad's life or Islam. Going
Mm,
to, all of these, as I mentioned, all of these councils in like the fourth and fifth century, these things
right.
were massively important. I mean, arguably,
Yeah, that's
Christianity
correct.
wouldn't exist as it is today without these
Yep.
councils. And,
Yeah, right.
so yeah, that book will be published. if everything goes according to plan, God willing, it'll be out by this time next year, and it'll be published by Hearst in Oxford.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
So that's a should be a good book, I hope.
Indeed. Well, this is fantastic, Professor. If you listen to all my interviews, every single one, I never get to, I never get to this long list of stuff that I plan to
We
discuss.
could
But
talk forever, I feel like. We really could.
yeah, yeah. But I think that all of us have benefited tremendously, and I think this will be an interview to listen to for a long time to come. And we'll definitely have to get together and to discuss many of the issues untouched so far that are in this book, and especially this path breaking. I guess on television news, people always like want to break the news. You can break the news on our show, but we've kind of broken the news here of some of the work that you're doing coming up.
Yeah,
So,
I haven't really talked much of. Really, I've hardly shared any knowledge about this forthcoming book, but
it's fantastic. Well, we can't wait, and we pray for blessings over your
thank you.
capacity to sit still.
Yeah, not
Yeah,
easy, not easy.
yeah,
Yeah.
right,
But
right.
like writing for me it's a spiritual act. It's part of who I am as a religious person and as a Christian. I think people often think that I'm like this very rigid person who goes to church every single day and follows a very kind of methodical approach to my faith. And because I do like writing, I actually consider writing, engaging with scholarship to be a form of worship in a way. And I know that may sound very new age thinking, but it's a spiritual act for me. Trying to
Yeah,
gain a better understanding of how we got here, who are we as humans. So it's deep stuff, and I've been blessed.
yeah,
I've been blessed to find something I'm passionate about, and I'm able to kind of be alone and write and be okay with that. So I'm lucky.
beautiful. I didn't think of New Age. I thought of the iconographers that
Yeah.
pray 5 times before a single brushstroke. So there's a great tradition of the spirituality of the work.
Are you familiar, Frank, with the Book of Kells?
Yes.
Yeah, so that I went to Trinity College in Dublin, so I saw the Book of Kells a bunch of times, and that is I guess the quintessential example of
Yeah.
that type of creation of a book or a piece of scholarship as an act of worship.
Right. Exactly right. Oh, this is so thrilling. It's very hard to stop,
Well,
but
we
this
can
has been
always
a
do it again.
blessing.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, we surely
I
will.
really enjoyed your thoughtful questions, and I just really appreciate your aura and your spirit, and even how you speak about it, and it seems really thoughtful, and I really appreciate that. And the term I like to use is a kindred spirit, and I think we're probably kindred spirits, even though we've never met in person, and hopefully that will all change soon once the COVID is over. But you're also my neighbor, Frank. I'm in Texas now, but I'm a Bostonian through and through, and my family's still there. So I'm sure one day I'll make it to New York, God willing.
Yeah, I can't wait. We'll pray for that. Thank you so much,
Thank you, Frank.
Professor Craig. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Look forward to our next time together.
Please invite me anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless.
God
Bye
bless.
bye.
Bye bye.